Hi, my name's Nadine Michel. I'm an MSTP student and I graduated with my PhD in neuroscience in the spring of 2020. During that time, I was transitioning basically from my PhD back to my third year of medical school. And in the spring of 2020, that was the rise of the pandemic and the lockdown, but it was also a time in our country that we were talking a lot about systemic racism and social injustice. And during that time, I had the opportunity to take a Black Physicians History course, and I learned a lot about the history of UVA and the role that it has, unfortunately, in the history of eugenics in this country. And I remember when I took that class, I kind of started putting a lot of different events that I had witnessed together in my mind. So was here at UVA when we renamed Jordan Hall to Penn Hall, and I was also here when we renamed the Behringer wing of the hospital to the Francis Collins wing, and had an idea that eugenics was part of the reason why these buildings were being renamed, but didn't fully understand the history or the context of all of it. And so when I took this class and I started to learn the history, I at first was very angry because I was thinking, why didn't I learn this before? You know, why wasn't this history taught? I think it's important for everyone to know about it. And so I decided to kind of channel all of the frustration that I was feeling at that time into making an educational resource for students so that they could learn about the history here. And I used a lot of the resources and the tools that have already been developed from professors in architecture and history and medicine here at UVA that have been looking into the history of the university during the era of segregation and while enslaved laborers were here. And I basically took all of those resources and put them together in this interactive timeline website. And you essentially can go through, click to learn about different people that were important in this history, different legislation that was important, and just learn how all of those different themes tie together, and just how, unfortunately, the history of eugenics really influenced legislation at the time, upholding racist laws that even led to racist scientific experiments and health disparities. I think the reason why it's important to know this history as a scientist is because, unfortunately, science is a double-edged sword. It has a lot of power. It can dictate the way that people are treated in society. And unfortunately, the race science that really fueled eugenics was this idea that Black people were inferior to white people. And a lot of scientists at that time were doing studies, unfortunately some of them at UVA, such as ones looking at the brain sizes of white people compared to Black people. And for a lot of these studies, they would go to the graves of enslaved laborers because they unfortunately didn't have rights, so they could steal the bodies, and then do the research studies, which didn't have appropriate controls, had small sample sizes, and they reached very biased conclusions. And those conclusions, unfortunately, were used at the Supreme Court level to uphold sterilization laws, Jim Crow laws, and basically laws that upheld segregation and discrimination. I think that sometimes it's easy to think that I'm just in the lab, I'm working with my cells, this doesn't have an impact on society, but it really does. And I think that as graduate students in BIMS, that this is the time for us not to just learn how to be great scientists, how to be critical thinkers, how to think objectively. It's also time for us to think about the social implications of our work. Who are we including in our studies? What is the end goal of our studies? And how do we better represent our communities and marginalized populations in the work that we do? So I'm excited for the time that you guys have at UVA as BIM students. I know that it can be overwhelming to learn all of this history, but I think it's important to really dig in and take the time to know the history of Charlottesville and also know the people who have lived here for a long time. There's so much history here, but there's so many great lessons that you can learn.